Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for joining the latest Disasters as Turning Point session. My name is Anna Canny. I'm the Science Communications Lead here at the Natural Hazard Center. And as I mentioned, this Disasters as Turning Point series, something we launched this year, and the goal really is to bring together experts like those of us on the call today, who can reflect on specific disasters that served as catalysts for change in research policy and practice in the field. So we've been looking back on disasters 5, 10, 15, and even today, 50 years later, to kind of talk about how these seminal events can spur change. So we're excited to talk about that today. A bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar will be recorded. Oh, sorry. And the recording and transcript will be posted on our website on the event page. Today we're talking about the Big Thompson Flood. So you can follow that link to catch up later. If you know people who can attend today, there will be a recording there. I also want to thank everyone who posed thoughtful questions with registration. We've tried to incorporate some of those into our discussion today, and we'll try to save some time at the end to get to more of those. So put your questions in the chat as they come to you, or save them for the end and we'll grab a few. But regardless, the questions that everyone submitted were really thoughtful, so we appreciate that. So today we're going to be talking about the Big Thompson Flood. I just want to talk a little bit about why we wanted to mark this particular disaster and give you a little bit of context on what happened 50 years ago. So just a couple of weeks ago was the 50th anniversary. On the evening of July 31st, 1976, a powerful thunderstorm stalled over the headwaters of the Big Thompson River. And over the course of just over an hour, just a couple of hours, the storm dropped nearly a year's worth of rain, about 12 inches, on the steep slopes of the Big Thompson Canyon, which stretches roughly from Estes Park to Loveland. That's just northeast of Denver for our folks who are joining us from out of state. This rainfall triggered a flash flood, which sent a 20-foot wall of water down the canyon. And as you can imagine, it destroyed roads, bridges, power lines, infrastructure throughout its path, and more than 400 homes and businesses. That amounted to more than $35 million of damage in 1976 dollars. That's about 180 million today. So a very costly disaster as well. The timing of the storm, I want to mention because it made it particularly devastating, and it coincided with celebrations of Colorado's statehood centennial. Obviously, as those of us in Colorado might know, we're celebrating the 150th this year. But that celebration, as well as the fact that it was the last holiday weekend before many school sessions started, had drawn many tourists into the area. Big Thompson Canyon is a beautiful area of Colorado, popular for hiking, camping, and fishing. And so though there were only about 600 people who lived in the canyon year round, it's estimated that up to 3,500 people were in and around the canyon at the time of the flood, which increased vulnerability to this event. In the end, 144 people were killed, and a significant number of them, I want to mention, were tourists and out-of-state visitors, and more than 250 people were injured. Hundreds more were stranded in the canyon overnight until the floodwaters receded. And this event is the deadliest in recorded history in Colorado's history. And so obviously that makes it looms large in memory for a lot of the Front Range, Colorado, especially where a lot of this mountainous geography, these steep mountain slopes, sharp, dramatic canyons, make many communities, including Boulder, where the Natural Hazard Center is based, particularly vulnerable to flash floods. And as of course, I'm sure some of you are thinking of, we've also seen more recent devastating flash floods elsewhere in the country, particularly the Central Texas floods last summer, which coincidentally also happened over sort of a celebratory holiday weekend. And so I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, a commonality. So a flood like the Big Thompson flood could happen again, but really our hope, I think, across the hazards and disasters community is that the losses that happened 50 years ago, 5 decades now, don't have to be repeated. And so one of our hopes really is to talk about the research that came out of the event and what we've learned and the progress we still need to make to keep people safe. So I'm really grateful to be joined by a great lineup of panelists today, and I'll let them introduce themselves. But they are experts in research and emergency management, as well as community members who have been deeply involved in studying the Big Thompson Flood and in remembering its legacy and in working to apply some of the lessons learned. So I'll turn it over to them, and maybe we could just introduce yourselves in order as you appear on the screen. So we'll start with Tina.
Hi, thanks for having me, Anna, and I really appreciate what you're doing. My name is Tina Anderson, and I was 9 years old in the Big Thompson Flood of '76. My best friend, Teresa Graham, was one of the 5 that was never found, and she was 10. My mother was key in getting survivor stories put together and making sure that this event is never forgotten, along with those people. Um, I don't know what else. Is that enough for now? Again, I'm not I'm not really good at this.
That was perfect. We'll talk more about your memorial work in just a minute. So yeah, that's plenty for now. Thanks, Tina.
Next. Yeah, so I'm Eve Grenfest, and I was a 23-year-old graduate student at the time of the Big Thompson Flood, looking for a thesis topic. And then there was this giant flood in the backyard, and the Urban Drainage and Flood Control District in Denver contacted Gilbert White at the time and said, hey, this big flood happened in our backyard. How can we sort of benefit from this so that we can be better prepared for when such a storm occurs over Denver? And so 2 studies were commissioned. One was 2 small studies, $10,000 studies. One was by Tom Downing, and he looked at what would happen if the Big Thompson Flood occurred in Boulder. So he looked at kind of the infrastructure in Boulder. And then my thesis was a look at what actions people took that night that led to either them living or dying. And so I had the opportunity to go to a lot of the community meetings and to search through college newspapers to find people who were in the canyon that night and to really find out what actions people did when they either got a message. Mostly they didn't get a message. Sometimes there were environmental cues. And that was when we first learned that driving wasn't the best to do, even though Tina ended up surviving because they must have gone to a high point on the road. But a lot of people didn't know that the road also had very low points. And when the road washed out, the people in the cars got washed away. So we'll stop there.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lori Hodges. I'm the Director of Emergency Management in Larimer County, where the Big Thompson flood occurred. And I guess what I would say is I was 5 at the time of the flood, so I wasn't really a part of the flood. I wasn't in this area. But I think that disasters are often measured by what they destroy. And I think the Big Thompson flood needs to also be remembered for something, for what it built. Because a lot of the systems that we use today in emergency management were built because of the Big Thompson flood and the other disasters of that time. So I just wanted to say that in the beginning that I think that we should celebrate all that was built from the flood as well as remembering what was destroyed.
I guess that's me.
Yep.
So this is the overview of my work and whatnot. Well, thanks, Anna, and welcome to the participants. July 1976 was my second catastrophic flood. Whilst I was with the Corps of Engineers, 1972 Tropical Storm Agnes in eastern United States was equally catastrophic. So I went from a degree in 1971 in groundwater hydrology to 55 years of flood research. I think there's very little time for warning for and response for floods like this then and now. There's there's been large loss of life that's occurred from the 2024 North Carolina Hurricane Helene in North Carolina, 108 people killed. In 2025 in the Texas Hill Country, 120 approximately. So these types of events do still occur, are still occurring. One thing that got me during the 76 flood was a number of visitors commented that they thought the July 36 first rain and river rise was normal. And so they didn't do anything. So much more emphasis and focus on educating and warning visitors to these types of areas, whether it's the Big Thompson or anywhere in the country or around the world. During and after the Big Thompson flood, there was a near universal belief that in atmospheric sciences and flood sciences that the 1976 storm, which went up to about 60,000 feet in altitude, and the resulting flood could occur anywhere in the Rocky Mountains, which only go up to about 14,000 feet. There's a misuse of the term wall of water for the 76 flood and virtually all other flash floods. The Big Thompson was not a wall of water. The water rose about 4/10 of a foot every minute, or a total of 19 feet in 50 minutes at the Big Thompson and mouth of the canyon. So there is some time, very limited, for people to react and seek safety with proper guidance. What that proper guidance is what we're really talking about here. So after the 1936 flood, I was part of a USGS team that was flown into Drake because all the roads were washed out by the National Guard. And we stayed at the Hotel Drake, which was the name of our campsite, to document with field surveys flood discharges at 36 ungauged sites, as well as the 2 gauging station sites in the canyon, but both of those were washed out, which is typical of most of these types of catastrophic floods. We also mapped the flood boundaries in the flooded area. Flood frequency at that time, you could only report the flood as up to a 100-year flood. In this case, it was reported that it was greater than a 100-year flood. The product was a USGS professional paper, 1115, the 1976 Meteorology, Flood Hydrology, and Geomorphic Effects of the Flood. So thanks for that time right there. Back to
Thank
you,
you.
Anna.
Thank you all so much for those introductions. We're excited to sort of dig in more to all the things you mentioned, just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the things you studied and the impact of the flood. So, but I want to start back with you, Tina. You mentioned that you and your family were survivors of the Big Thompson flood, are survivors of the Big Thompson flood. And one of the reasons that we originally connected is that your mother, Barbara Anderson, was very involved in this initial gathering of stories from survivors and victims and families of the flood, and she organized many memorial events over the years. And you took over this year for the 50th annual remembrance of the event, which you held just a couple of weeks ago. So I wanted to ask, like, since we're here talking about an anniversary, why do you think marking the date of the Big Thompson flood was so important to you and to your mother before you, and how have you seen its importance for the community now? Even we're talking 50 years later, and it was still a very well attended event this year, I understand. So what are you hearing from the community about the importance of this anniversary?
Well, I think it is important every year to recognize and remember, because we want people to be warned. We want them to be aware of their surroundings. Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, you can look behind me; it's gorgeous. But it can become a monster in a matter of. And every year when we gathered, more and more people healed from that gathering, because once it hit, people lost their homes and their families. Some of them lost their jobs. They had to come back in, try to get back in and salvage what was left of their life. Yes, there were many that were from out of state. And for them, they still went home with the trauma of what they had went through. But it continued for those of us who stayed in the canyon to clean up and try to get back to some sense of normality. And my mom started looking into doing a memorial every year, honestly, because of me. 17 years later, I had PTSD watching helicopters fly over. Had no idea. Thought that was only for people in the military, that would happen. But she realized that there was no place for me to go. Again, my best friend being still listed as missing. And even though they had her sister, her mother, and her grandmother, they chose to scatter their ashes. There was no place to memorialize them. There was no place to gather. And as my mom and others helped get the community back together, it really helped in the healing process. And educated us on, okay, well, so at what point did this wall of water hit you? And there was and it was not necessarily just the water. It was because we had debris dam up, and then a huge wall would let loose and a huge wall of water would come. Surges would come, like the one that took out Officer Purdy, who was trying to warn people. And so kind of on our own as a community, we still stick to call each other, check with each other, what's going on up above. I can still call Estes Park and say, are you guys getting a lot of rain? Like, what's going on up there? Cameras don't show you that, and unless you're on a good data site getting what the CFS is for sure coming down that river, you don't know. And it can come down different tributaries. So the biggest thing was, first of all, to remember those who lost their lives. And for people who survived, to be reconnected with people who helped save them. Whether it was another neighbor or an EMT or a patrol officer, all of those people played a huge part in us being able to heal as a community. And they really do. Again, my mom passed away and I thought, don't have another one, Tina. It's been 50 years. Oh my gosh. It's still very important to all of us, and to gather in a communal way and fellowship and celebrate the lives of those that were lost.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I feel like it speaks to sort of the connection the community has built through these events, that you were sort of surprised that people were still coming 50 years later in such numbers and processing this
Yes.
event. And from what you shared with me, it sounds like people were still maybe attending for the first time or engaging with it for the first time, even 50 years later,
Yes.
at this year's
Well,
memorial.
children and grandchildren, right? And your
Yes.
mother wrote a book also. I mean, if people are interested, they can read your mom's book.
So those are survival stories that she gathered and edited. So as she would want me to say, she didn't write the book, the people did.
Mhm.
There's actually 3 of them. And that in turn also helped. So thank you for reminding me, Eve. That helped people understand what others went through and find out they weren't alone. And so, I mean, I was 9 in 76 and I was 46 in 2013 and went through it again. And even the people who went through the 2013 kind of, come to the 76 because we did learn, well, we obviously learned something and people listened. Of course, there were probably less tourists in the canyon at the time. We lost 2 in our canyon, and I think along the Front Range, there was a total of 9 lives lost. And that's ultimately what we want. No loss of life.
Mm.
And like I said, my mom knew everybody. I'm still learning, but she did an amazing thing. And I don't think she realized just how many lives she touched.
Yeah, and just to the book that you've mentioned, that it's Reflections on the River, correct me if I'm wrong, but we'll
There's reflections of the river, then there's reflections of the heart and memories of the heart. So there are 3 books, plus there are still multiple stories, and they're still coming in, that mom didn't have time to do another book.
Mm.
And so all of those are going to be sent to the library in Loveland, where they will be archived and they will be digitally preserved. Because as we all know, not everybody wants things we pass down. So I want to make sure that these are preserved in a place where if people want to search for them, they can and find out what happened to their loved ones.
I'll be adding links to those books on the webpage after the event. So if anyone's interested in looking into those more, I'll make sure to add those.
Thank you.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about looking back on some of the vulnerabilities that existed at 1976 and how those have changed, what we've learned in the time since. And Bob, you talked a lot about this that you were deployed right after the flood for some of those initial studies. And I know you continue to do flood research for the last 5 decades and beyond from as a result of that. So I want to talk a little bit about how our understanding or basically how the devastation of the Big Thompson flood spurred new flood research and how our understanding of how these flood events have happened has changed over the last 5 decades. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about those continuing studies that happened after your initial sort of report on the damage. Sir, you're muted. Bob, you're muted still. Sorry
Okay.
about that. Yep. Now we can hear you. Take it from the
Sorry
top.
about that.
That's okay.
I don't know how I did that, but there could be more. Yeah, first, very briefly, there's been remarkable improvements in atmospheric sciences and early warnings in the past 50 years, which I'm not really best qualified to discuss. However, I think most of us in the atmospheric flood community recognize it's extremely difficult to predict the exact location, whether it's the Big Thompson Basin or the Little Thompson or wherever it is in the country or around the world, where these catastrophic localized storms and floods occur, which can result in, and typically is what causes a large loss of life. So uh, I was in terms of the 50 years of flood research, it's 55 now, uh, I was part of and then led a USGS multidisciplinary Colorado flood study, which is funded by the USGS, other federal agencies, state and local flood agencies, to better understand the 1976 flood and to answer what areas are subject to flash floods, and also can we get a better handle on what the frequency or recurrence of the 1976 flood? So we used mixed population flood frequency analysis, and I developed flash flood potential indices. And I won't go into those now. Anyone that's interested in them, I'll be happy to send them the presentation that I did on July 31st uh, on that anniversary meeting. So what we were able to do with that analysis and flood potential was we quantified that above about 7,500 feet is the limit for convective rainfall flooding in Colorado. So the elevation limit of these high intensity flash floods are about 8,000 feet in New Mexico in southern Rockies, and in the northern Rockies in Montana and Idaho, it's about 5,500 feet. In the Canadian Rockies, researchers up there found the elevation limit is slightly lower. So we can get extremely large flash floods, 6,000 cubic feet per second per square mile below 7,500 feet as a result of 4 to 7 inches of rain in an hour, versus above about 7,500 feet, 150. So well over an order of magnitude, 3 or 4 times the order of magnitude less runoff per unit area due to either snow melt or moderate runoff. John Cost and I developed paleo flood methods for mountain rivers. So paleo flood hydrology, very briefly, is the study of environmental signatures of past floods, typically tree scars and particularly flood deposited sediments, to obtain flood discharges and ages of pre-gating station floods. So paleoflood hydrology can provide data on the most extreme floods that have occurred in the last 5 to 10,000 years. It's very cost effective and results can be provided in a very short period of time. So these types of paleoflood studies were done for over 1,000 streams in Colorado and support this 7,500-foot elevation limit. We were able to show that John Costa particularly was able to demonstrate that the 1976 was the largest flood in the canyon in the last 10,000 years. With flood frequency analysis with the paleoflood data, we showed that the flood recurrence interval was somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10,000 years. We identified the causes of the misperception of 1976 Big Thompson storm could occur anywhere in the Rocky Mountains. Anyone interested in what those were, I can go into that later or contact me via email. I did extensive decades worth of research on the hydraulics of mountain rivers, which are slopes greater than 1%, because virtually all research and understanding of river hydraulics were done on low gradient rivers elsewhere in the country. As part of my research, 55 master's and PhD students were partially funded. I mentored them, was their advisor via the USGS project, Paleoflood Hydrology and Climate Change. And they did work on flood hydrology, paleoflood hydrology and dam safety, sediment transport, geomorphic effects of floods, and a number of other topics. So with the paleoflood data, we were able to use those for assessments of dam safety, such as Olympus Dam in Estes Park, Cherry Creek Dam in Denver, and many other dams around the country. John Englund, previously with the Bureau of Reclamation, now with the Corps of Engineers, is one of the top flood scientist engineers in the country right now. He and others developed Bulletin 17B, which is an improvements on flood frequency methods incorporating historical and paleoflood data. And John has been instrumental in substantial development of risk assessments for dam safety. So one of the issues that comes up is what's still a limiting factor to our understanding. Well, since about 1980, and take that as a very rough estimate, there's been statements made over and over, we can model rain and flood processes better than we can measure them. The result of that is now there's very little ground truth of observed data of these extreme rainstorms and floods for improving the modeling approaches. So it's a limitation on how we can model these types of events. Most critical issue is understanding extreme rainfall. And there's no time right now, perhaps later, or people can contact me, but there's great insights I've made recently with evaluations of NOAA Atlas 14 and soon to come out NOAA Atlas 15 on rainfall frequency estimates errors that are extremely unreliable for large storms. So thanks for this time.
Thank you. And I'm sure we'll maybe circle back to that at the end, this idea of
Sure.
the issues we're still facing today. The extreme rainfall, I think, is one that's on a lot of people's minds, and how to get a better idea of how that plays into flood risk. So the other element of vulnerability that I think obviously is really important to talk about, and Tina kind of touched on this, is this idea of public awareness around events and also flood warning. And so I want to talk a little bit about how what we have available today compares to 1976, and maybe it's best to start with you, Tina, about, you mentioned your family's narrow escape from the flood. Could you talk a little bit about what the details of how you found out at that time, how people were finding out at that time? Because I think it was pretty notable that you mentioned this importance of checking on your neighbors and things. And yeah, so what was it like in 1976? How did you find out about the flood in your memory?
In 1976, my mother received a phone call. I want to say it was about 9 o'clock at night. from Alice Gifford up the canyon who lived near Waltonia. And she just asked my mom, she's like, Barb, what's the river like there? Mom says, well, let me go check and I'll call you back, because that was before portable phones, you know. And so my mom went outside and pulled the river pump out of the river, put some lawn chairs away, came back in, shut the basement door, and put a rug underneath the door. So maybe 10 minutes time lapse. And Alice called back and she said, Barb, get out now. The Waltonia Bridge just went. Waltonia was the strongest bridge in the canyon, from what I understand. Again, I was 9. Concrete, rebar, and I'm going to guess at the same time that's when the SS Rapids went. So you have all of that debris building up, and it just pushed that bridge. Now, it did that multiple times coming down the canyon as it picked up more and more debris, back up more water, go again. So people were definitely caught off guard, even though the river was okay. Here's the level. All of a sudden, here comes a wall of water because it has been dammed up by all this debris. Had it not been for Alice, she said she thought of everybody who had children in the canyon, and that's who she started calling. She saved a lot of lives that night. Honestly, it's still kind of the same way. We have to stay in touch with each other. We do have more technology, but it is more neighbors helping neighbors. We can, as long as we've still got power, we can still get on our phones and, okay, who's on Facebook? What's going on up there? Or make a phone call. But it took out all the electricity, it took out the power, the telephone lines. So the major thing was that, Officer Purdy, the state patrolman that lost his life, Mom and Dad could hear him yelling on his loudspeaker, but couldn't make out what he was saying because the moving of the rocks and everything else in the river was drowning that out. So there just was Alice. And we got all of our neighbors in the car, and we had one little old lady that said, oh, the river's risen here before, but boy, Dad almost kicked her into the car just to get her in. It's like, let's go. And by the time we drove up and out of our area, the river was at our wheels. And as soon as Dad stepped out, that was when he could hear the screams and the flashing, people flashing their lights in their cars and honking their horns because they're all in the river.
Yeah. Well, a very personal account of this, but I know Eve, you did some groundbreaking work on sort of how people across the canyon responded and got out or didn't that night. I'm wondering if you could just give us kind of an overview of that study, that thesis work you mentioned in your beginning introduction. What did you find about what kind of information was available to these people who were trying to get out, and how did people respond during the flood generally?
Well, the only thing that was available was either a call from Alice or environmental cues. Really, that was all that was. And the environmental cues were easy to, think this couldn't possibly happen, or, I've lived here all my life and the river's never done this. But anyway, a lot of people kept doing whatever they were doing, and a lot of them were driving. And so, my study was really to find out what actions people took. Did they get in their cars? Did they climb to safety? What did they do? And anyway, it resulted in the signs being placed at Front Range canyons. And, one of the remarkable things is people always ask me, did those signs make any difference? Or people say, oh, they're the stupidest things I've ever seen. Or, now that I'm 73, the idea that I'm going to climb the hill on a rainy night when it's slippery and dark and very wet is, preposterous. But anyway, I don't know. No one's ever evaluated the benefit of those signs, but they were put there with the idea that not that people would see them the night they needed to see them, but that people who lived in the canyon or who regularly visited the canyon would remember that they did have an idea of what to do in case of a flash flood. So they wouldn't just necessarily keep doing what they were doing, which was driving and leading to them not making it. Because if you're on higher ground, you are more likely to survive, of course. And I also wanted to mention that I think a lot of research came out of this, but most of the research, as always, is physical science. And, I think we need to really spend a lot more attention on what people do and why they do it. So, people say, how do we get the message to people? Let's ask people what kind of information they use, where they get it. And so there's two people who have done flash flood research recently that I want to call attention to if anyone's interested. So Isabelle Rouen, who's in Grenoble, France, she's a geographer, and she's done a lot of work on why people drive during flash floods. And she found out when she asked them, it was because they needed to go to work. It was because work was requiring that they be there. They didn't have the option. They thought the risk of losing their job was worse than the risk of losing their life in a flood. They just underestimated, or because of the practicality, they kept driving. And I also want to mention the work of Brenda Phillips, because she's doing really interesting things where she has people who are volunteering to use their phone data to show their GPS decision-making in real time to see if they're changing their routes or changing the days of their trips, or in relation to warnings that are issued, or high water points on the road, or low water crossings, or whatever. So, but again, most of the research is still on how to, give us, 15 minutes instead of 10 minutes. And I'm not sure that that's going to be the most useful in terms of really reducing the loss of life from the floods. And I also want to sound out for the 2013 flood, my view, and I don't know that Lori really shares it, but when I was watching what was going on, is that the relationships between the agencies, the emergency managers, the police, the road department, the fire department, everybody, the emergency managers, everybody was cooperating and collaborating the night that the warnings were issued for the 2013 flood. And there was so much confidence in the forecasts because of the years that all these agencies had worked together, and the people trusted each other, that the roads were closed preemptively. So like in France, people, if the roads are open, or in Colorado, if the roads are open, people have to go to work, they have to go to school. But if the roads are closed, then people have to say, I can't come to work because there's no way to get there. And that means that they're not in a vulnerable spot. So in terms of me being a 73-year-old woman, making a decision, likely I wouldn't find myself in the canyon the night that there was going to be, a big thunderstorm at the end of July. But I would just change my plan. But, why don't we find out more about what people would do and do in relation to the information that they have at hand?
Yeah, still a lot of questions about that response piece. And I'm glad you mentioned the interagency coordination. I just want to put a pin in that because we're definitely going to get back to that. But before, I do have a different question for Lori, which is just about how far we've come in terms of emergency alerts and warning systems. Obviously, there's a lot more tools available to you than just a phone call from neighbors, but I'm wondering how those different options have changed your capabilities in emergency management, and also on the flip side of that, what are some of the challenges you find still persist in terms of just sharing this information ahead of disasters or during disasters like the Big Thompson flood?
Yeah, so actually emergency management didn't really exist. We had the old Civil Defense Agency in the 1970s that was really about a nuclear threat. So FEMA, was formed 3 years after this event, and it was partially because of this event and other large floods that happened in the 1970s that they were able to get pressure on the federal government to form a federal agency. So, but locally though, and nationally, the flood really shaped modern flood warning systems overall. It also strengthened coordination among responders. The incident command system is now a standard practice for us. It helped grow the emergency management as a profession where everybody can get together and coordinate because they saw that is valuable in these large scale disasters. And then it also reinforced the importance of mitigation over reaction or response. So you need to mitigate as much as possible as well. So all of that kind of came out of the flood. But also outside of the National Weather Service and the expanded flash flood forecasting and warning capabilities, we've installed rain and stream gauges along all three of our major river systems in Larimer County now. So in our emergency operations center, real time, we're able to see not just how much rain is falling, but also how far is the river rising at any given point in time. And we get alarms on our phones now telling us if any part of the river system is, if any of those alarms are going off or if anything's going on, so that we can start working with the National Weather Service right away on warnings. Um, we have those climb to safety signs. I think that those climb to safety signs are a good thing because that's actually what saved most people in the flood was when they did climb to safety. Again, driving your vehicle in those flash floods is not what you want people to do, but in a canyon, you only have so many options, you know. And then communication systems also became more interoperable, so our agencies are able to communicate in many more ways. Amateur radio operators now are embedded into our emergency operations system, where during the flood, all of the dispatch centers went dark because all communications in the canyon went out, and it was actually the CB operators and the amateur radio operators that kept communications going. And so now they're embedded in our system. So we have that redundancy as well as an expanded communications. And then also, you know, the sheriff's office still to this day goes door to door during these emergencies as much as they can and as it's safe to do so. They're going to go door to door knocking and making sure that every person gets the information and knows what action to take. And then we have, as was mentioned, the flashing lights at the canyon. So when there is a flash flood warning, we can do the flashing lights and we can close the road proactively. I think all of that is great stuff. It's things that we can do to help people make the right decisions. And that gets to my challenge. The challenge is one, we have to contend with the terrain of the Big Thompson Canyon. Because of the terrain, we can't have all the technology that currently exists out there available to the residents in that canyon. It just doesn't work in that environment. So we have to, we do have ways to reach people, but it's more limited than it would be in an urban environment. But also we have the challenge of people really not doing what the warning tells them to do. Like we have the challenge of, do we warn ahead of time, or do we warn early, or do we overwarn, right? So we're constantly struggling with, are people getting too many warnings where they're going to disregard it? Or are we not giving the warning at enough time so people can actually act and get out of the canyon or get to a place of safety? Those are two things that I think we're always going to have a challenge with. And we're always working with the National Weather Service to determine at what point is it a point where we need to give this warning. In the Cameron Peak wildfire, we had really bad flash flood risk in our canyons throughout the county after that fire. So we actually created a new warning that never had been used in the county before, called an imminent threat warning, that gave the language of seek high ground immediately. That's what it told people. And because I think people had never heard that warning before, they really took it seriously and they moved. So that was another lesson from that. But that's the biggest challenges. One is the terrain is always going to be an issue. And then also we're dealing with people who may or may not act when they get the warning.
Yeah, and that goes back to, I think, this public awareness piece across the board of when you're talking about extreme events like this, that maybe people don't have the experience with these events before. Like, how do you actually predict how people will respond, and how do you continue to cultivate sort of that awareness in blue sky days is
Yeah, and you know, I used to walk my dogs next to Spring Creek here in Fort Collins, and it's like this little trickle where I would walk over it, right, as I'm walking my dogs. And we had this Spring Creek flood that flooded all of Fort Collins. So people don't realize how fast the water can get up to a level to where it can take a life, you know, and especially in a canyon where it's, you know, isolated, that water could definitely rise a lot faster than people really realize it can, especially if they're a visitor.
yeah. I just want to follow up quickly on you. You mentioned so much about this interagency cooperation and improved communication. How does that come into play ahead of just, or again, like in day-to-day coordination between extreme weather events? Like, how have you strengthened that sort of communication across northern Colorado agencies that might be called in an emergency management situation? Oh, sorry, Lori, you're muted.
Northern Colorado is kind of known for our collaboration, which I think is a good thing to be known for. We tend to work together all the time on various challenges that we have. So when a disaster occurs, it's not a hard jump to collaborate then as well. I do think though that one example is because we have fire and flood as our two big hazards in the county. The National Weather Service is also embedded in our Emergency Operations Center. Even when we're virtual, they're in our virtual environment and they're talking to us the whole time. about what they're seeing, and they're asking us too what we're seeing and what we're hearing from the ground. I didn't mention that, but we still really depend upon ground spotters. Somebody put in the chat, how do you, with technology or what otherwise, what are the ways in which we can, strengthen these systems? And we really depend upon the people who are there because the systems can only tell us so much. So we have all of that information coming in and we're constantly talking to them and we're changing our warnings as we go, to make sure that we're giving the most accurate information that we can. So I think that that's a really good collaboration. Another good collaboration is during the one of our big wildfires we were going to have a utilities failure that was going to cause the 911 dispatch center to lose service because of a fiber line. And all the utility providers got into the room together and they collaborated and they were able to create a redundant fiber line about an hour before we lost the primary line to the fire. So there was never an interruption in service to the 911 center, but it's only because those people are willing to get to a room together and say, we've got a problem, we need to try to fix it. And we're able to kind of work through that.
Mm. Thanks. Thank you so much. I think we have about time for one more question and then we'll take it to questions from the audience. But I want to turn back to you, Eve, for just a minute because you mentioned in the last response you had about the need to continue to incorporate social science, which of course is near and dear to our cause at the Natural Hazard Center. And I'm curious about, after decades and decades of flash flood research, I'm wondering what your questions are in terms of the things that make people vulnerable and the questions we really have still to look into about how to reduce vulnerability to these extreme floods. I know.
Yeah, well, the obvious answer is ask people what they're thinking.
Yeah.
Connect with the people who were affected, the people in the canyon, the people driving, the people, and social science can do that. I also wanted to say, we talked earlier about after the Big Thompson flood, there was this real sense, how can we learn from this disaster? And so we had a 10-year symposium and a 20-year symposium. And one of the remarkable things about that was they brought together people from all the different silos to talk about an event. So they had to get out of their silos and talk about mapping, or they had to talk about warnings, or they had to, they had to translate their own languages so that the atmospheric scientists and the hydrologists and the social scientists and Tina and Lori, could all be in the same room and tackle the same problems, which, seems like an obvious thing, but it rarely happens even now. So at the 10th anniversary and the 20th anniversary of the flood, which hardly anybody ever does, puts together these like, what have we learned kind of things, whether it's in locally or elsewhere. And I also wanted to say before we wrap up that it's remarkable that people are talking about my work 50 years after I did it, just like I'm sure Bob feels that way too. And so I just wanted to sort of reach out to the 20-year-olds who are watching this and think about, what work you're doing and how you might have a central core to your work that actually does provide a basis for a lifelong commitment to trying to learn from events and trying to understand flash floods more, understand people's behavior more, because it's really a remarkable thing and a real tribute to the Hazard Center. And Anna, it's really great you put this together, and Lori Peake's vision and Gilbert White's vision, that this kind of conversation is even happening, because it's rarer than I would like. So I'll close it there.
I will just, shout out. My blur is messing it up, but I have a copy of from the 20 years later symposium that you've put together. And I'll just reiterate that call to, like, if you are working at an institution where there's been some sort of seminal disaster in your area, using that power you have to organize people and reflect on these events, I think.
And to keep the memory alive too, to remind people that this happened and that technology changes and our ability to react and our collaborations change. I mean, like Lori's pointing out, the actors involved in 2026 are some of the actors that we never even imagined being involved in 1976. And, the visuals that we have and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah. And the questions that the issues that endure. If you're a young researcher, I would encourage you to look at something like this, because I'm looking at a page that says importance of low-tech measures and environmental cues. And certainly we have much more tech than we did in 1986. So,
but we're still talking about low-tech. Neighbors call you up, or the ground truthing that you call the emergency managers or the weather service. Yeah. So I also wanted to say that another benefit is when you have something in your career that's, following you through, you can have a lot of adventures with that. Of course, I think geography is the way to do it, but there's lots of other ways to do it. But like in 1999, we had a conference in NATO Advanced Studies Institute in Ravello, Italy, where I had the opportunity to bring together the people I thought were the premier people in flash flooding. And, it wasn't a bad place to have a meeting on the Amalfi Coast. So, these people become your lifelong colleagues and friends. So for those of you who are young and trying to figure this out, I'm always available to chit chat with you about possibilities or how to sort of wend a thread or develop a thread.
Well, thank you so much. We have time for just a couple of audience questions. And so I know some of you kind of already addressed this one, but maybe we'll start with the one from Lindsay, since it's the one in the chat. And please, if anyone has more questions, please drop them in there. But her question was, given how important warnings are for people to take actions in these short fuse events, and given the reductions in funding and staffing at some of these federal agencies that provide warnings, what concerns do you have? And what strategies can we use to keep people safe in future events? And anyone can take this, but maybe might be nice to start with Lori, since you're the one working in those circumstances most closely.
Really quickly, I would say the concern that we would have is if you do have budget cuts and a lack of funding, you may no longer have obviously the ability to look at that technology and trust that the technology has the right data. Right now, we've been assured that the staff isn't impacted and that we do still have that, but that's always going to be a concern for us. So the way that you go about that is having redundant systems, having multiple ways in which we get the information. We don't just depend upon the National Weather Service. We also have other weather groups that we work with. And it's just about gathering all that information and seeing what it tells us, and then how do we act from there.
I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on that. We also have a question from the Zoom registration that I can pose.
I have a quick question, if I may.
Yeah.
Ms. Lori, thank you so very much for this. All of this is educating me on the other side of this, not so much the emotional side. But, and Lori, maybe you guys already have this, but what about volunteers on the ground in the canyon? Do we have that now? And even if we don't talk about this now, I would like to just find out a little bit more how I can continue to be a part of a community and know when I should do whatever it is I need to do.
Yeah, even in 1976, they were very dependent upon ground spotters, and we still are today. People who are measuring either the water that's coming down or giving us an idea about when storms are coming in, when it starts to rain in a certain area. So that's always going to be very important, whether it's working directly with the National Weather Service as a spotter or working with us on ground observations. We rely on that a lot, especially when we issue a warning. We want to know, are you seeing what we think you were going to see during that warning? And the Weather Service always asks us, have you gotten any reports of damages or flooding? So that's always important to us. So yes, we can chat afterward about how to get connected.
Okay, that would be awesome. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to pose this question from the Zoom, which I think, Tina, you've kind of touched on, but I thought was interesting. And it was, how did the flood change the way community members collaborate or relate to one another? Have the years of recovery brought any silver linings for the community? And I think probably that's best suited for you, but I thought it was an interesting question. So wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Was this for Eve?
Oh, no, for you, Tina.
For me. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I got
That's
buzzed
okay.
by a hummingbird at that point in time. I would have to say in the canyon, we're not as close as we were in 76. And that has nothing to do with floods, but everything to do with society and the way things have kind of went over the last several years. Our COVID epidemic has made everybody afraid of each other. Like, we need to get back to neighbors being neighbors. Don't know if that's going to happen in my lifetime or not. It would be great. All we can do is be the best neighbors we can to each other. And we do that quite frequently here. I will get the videos from my neighbor down below me that there's a bear or a mountain lion. That's always fun. Um, and we do, when people are gone, or like this morning, I'm sitting out there and I'm like, we doubled the CFS in that water this morning in the river. And so I started kind of looking to see why. I'm just not sure I have an answer on that yet, but like Eve said, it's being aware of your surroundings. That's the biggest thing. And in any, and again, that's just from my experience, both times you start seeing the water change colors. There's more sediment. Something's happening up above. You see some trees. You see a couple limbs. It's getting higher. 13, first propane tank that went over, I was right by the pipe at the dam store. And I knew then we were in trouble. So
I think it's great, Tina, that you know what CFS are. I hope Bob picked that up too, because I bet there are not that many people who live in canyons along rivers anywhere in the United States, who have no professional training. We talk about the CFS of the river. Very nice. Cubic feet per second, in case people don't know what that is.
Thank you. Well, that's something, again, that you learn and you start paying attention to. And where I live is still the same place, lived in 76. So the neighbors here are much elderly. I've known them for many, many years, myself included. But we still make sure we get each other out. And I hope that we can get back to that as a society, because it's really important. And I think we all miss some of that sometimes too.
Can I make a comment, Dan?
Yes, well, I was going to say, I'm going to ask, yes, please make a comment, but I'm going to also ask everyone a closing question, so maybe we could lump those together. Go ahead.
The discussion on preparedness, what Laurie did is great in subsequent discussion. But one of the main issues that I see is we can have all this preparedness, but you may go decades or 100 years or more until you get the next event. Some communities have multiple, back-to-back years with extreme floods. So the Big Thompson, 2 events in 50 years. So we need to recognize that if we go a long time between events, educating the public, it's going to really fall by the wayside to other things in their lives.
But that's also why it's important to learn from events like that. Denver and Boulder consider what can we learn from the event that happened up the hill, that we were lucky we didn't get that rainfall. And also the Texas floods, which we didn't get to because they're just too big a sad story in my view. But yeah, I mean, because that river did flood, in 86. So it wasn't nobody's lifetime, but it wasn't in a lot of people's lifetime. And the camps had been there 100 years. And anyway, one night, 150 people died.
Yeah.
In 2025. Let's just remember that. It wasn't even 1976.
Yeah.
Well, and kind of like you said, Eve, educating the younger people. So do we have this in our schools? Is this, a section that even, say you start with 6th graders, it will stick with them. I know that there were many that would come to Silverdale Guest Ranch. There was a group that would come. She would bring her students every year and educate them on what happened so that they educate their friends and they talk about it. And I don't know if that's something that's already implemented, but one of those thoughts that I've had, and just my opinion.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. And a good point to sort of end on is this education piece of like, this is an issue that affects everyone. It's a issue that affects school children who have no connection to our community. We here on this call are all interested in the topic, but how do we break out of these sort of research focused spaces?
And there's actually research by lots of people who are on the call, I think, about how experience relates to people's willingness to change their behavior the next time.
Yeah.
Or to learn from other people's experience, from whether seeing them on videos or TV or hearing them stories from someone else.
And I don't even know if the kids get out nowadays and go to the river, but what an awesome experience. So get them out in the no cell phone zone and ask them what they would do.
Well, thank you everyone for joining. We are at time and we end on time here at the Natural Hazard Center, but some of the panelists did mention they'd be willing to answer some more questions. So if anyone has lingering questions, I can put you in touch with folks or you can leave them in the chat and I'll make sure you get
And
connected.
I just want to say one final thing. I'm looking at the
Uh-huh.
chat, and one of the things we didn't have in 1976 was the ability to have a meeting that had people from New Zealand and Texas and
Exactly.
California and New York. I mean, my pal, I see Julia from New Zealand is on, and
Who
people
was,
from
and if
Colorado.
anyone wants to see Julia talk on a panel, she spoke on the Christchurch earthquake back in February. So there's a recording of that on our website. So another good conversation. But
Thanks, Anna, and thanks
yeah,
to Lori and Gilbert and all of you for
Thank
putting
you
this
all.
together.
thank you everyone. And I'll just say quickly, save the date. Our next Disasters as Turning Point webinar is going to be Tuesday, September 8th. And we're going to be discussing the legacy of the 25th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which were really monumental for our field as well. So yeah, we hope to see you at that one as well. So thank you so much. And yeah, we really appreciate it. Thank you to our panelists as well.
Thank you all, and God bless.